How many people view justice is, in my opinion, wrong. And it's wrong because their version of justice is ineffective at preventing harm and primarily focuses on making people hurt for no real reason. We need to change that, and should instead view justice as something with actual, productive end goals. This is Thoughtful Beetle, and today I'd like to spend some time unpacking justice and how it should be viewed and practiced. Now, there's a lot of different ways to understand what justice means. Two entertaining and informative sources that go over this are Crash Course Philosophy with Hank Green and ContraPoints with Natalie Wynn. Hank's video is a great rapid-fire review of the different philosophies of justice, and Natalie's video is longer, with more historical context, current events, and catgirl sounds. Both are linked in the description below as a courtesy to my fellow YouTubers, with whom I am, of course, co-equal, and I highly recommend watching one or both of them as background to understand what justice can mean. So there's a lot of different definitions, but what do most people view as justice? Well, broadly, here's what I think many people view as justice. It's retributive, merit-based, and focused on negative rights. Retributive meaning justice necessitates punishment, and punishment is in and of itself a good thing. Merit-based meaning people should get what they deserve based on what they do. And negative rights meaning people shouldn't be interfered with when trying to get what they need. And additionally, there's no moral obligation to help them get what they need if they can't get it on their own. Basically, punishment is good, people get what their actions deserve, and people should be allowed to get what they need without external help. Maybe you agree with some or all of these views. Many people do, and although it definitely varies, these are views of justice that people who are and have historically been in power in the US hold. And unsurprisingly, these views of justice fit well with American ideas like rugged individualism, capitalism and the free market, the American dream and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. These views of justice are also a big reason why things like the death penalty still exists in the US, why there's a fear of the welfare state and a distrust of interference in people's lives, and why harsh punishments and a reliance on imprisonment has long been viewed as just and fair. As to who holds these views, they tend to skew white, right, and evangelical Protestant. Again, probably not surprisingly. As examples, as of 2018, 59% of whites, 77% of Republicans, and 73% of evangelical Protestants favored the death penalty. This compared to 36% of blacks, 35% of Democrats, and 48% of the religiously unaffiliated. 68% of Republicans, and those who lean Republican, say it's not the government's responsibility to ensure people have health care coverage, while 85% of Democrats and those who lean Democratic say it is the government's responsibility. As of June 2020, 80% of Republicans and those who lean Republican did not view how racial and ethnic minorities are treated by the criminal justice system as a big problem, compared with 76% of Democrats and those who lean Democratic saying it was a big problem. Now, while these views of justice tend to be held by white religious conservatives, it's also true that these groups are not monoliths, and that many other people hold similar views of justice, so do keep that in mind. But white conservative Protestants represent much of the current and historical power structure in the United States, and tend to hold views of justice that prioritize punishment, self-help, and a strong belief in meritocracy. So, why do I think this view of justice is bad? Well, frankly, because it frequently doesn't lead to good outcomes and creates some pretty bad ones too. Tough on crime policies that favor punishment have led us in the United States to the highest rate of imprisonment in the world, and also leaves us with recidivism rates of 68% within 3 years after release. Additionally, there is a tacit and sometimes outright endorsement of horrible trauma and suffering being inflicted on criminals. The fact that prison rape is so widespread, well-known, and tolerated demonstrates this very well. Pop Culture Detective has an excellent video on this topic that I highly recommend watching, again, linked in the description below. Beyond prison, among rich, developed countries, we have one of the lowest rates of adults with healthcare coverage, and one of the highest poverty rates. These issues are even more exacerbated amongst minorities, and in particular, among black people. And throughout all this, there's this overarching sense that these issues cannot be the fault of the system or with how we view justice, and instead are the fault of individuals who just need to be more moral, more self-reliant, or more competent. And all of this creates a vicious cycle that constantly shifts the blame back onto those people who are already harmed the most by this view of justice. Additionally, I don't think this view of justice is supported by evidence, nor does it actually make sense as a way to view the world. There is not good evidence that harsh punishments like the death penalty and long imprisonments actually deter crime, and clearly they do not rehabilitate prisoners. The idea of a true merit-based system ignores reality and strongly favors people with opportunities without handicaps and panders to those who are already in power. It ignores the inequality we know exists in our world and society. After all, our prisons are full of people who grew up in poverty, who did not attain higher education, who suffer from mental illness and/or previous trauma, and who are Black or Hispanic. Rich, educated white people who had lives without trauma are not more meritorious. They just didn't have life circumstances that drastically increased their chances of incarceration. And when you view negative rights as primary, that is, you get out of the way and let people get what they need without the moral burden of having to help them, you can easily wash your hands of inequality that exists. Because it isn't your job to help people. It's their job to fix themselves. This explains the great deal of concern over people being treated too well, or of poor people having too much. A great example of this is from a Fox News clip from 2011, where they talk about a report from the Heritage Foundation that laments that poor people have refrigerators, air conditioning, and microwaves. There is a very real fear of coddling people until they are unable to take care of themselves. This argument has always been strange to me, because basically it boils down to it being better to let people suffer or even die rather than risk them becoming too dependent. And finally, I have a particular problem with the idea that punishment is inherently just. With this view, punishment on its own is a good thing, meaning it doesn't have to deter crime or restore that which was damaged or rehabilitate anybody. At its core, retributive justice is saying that making people hurt, even if there is no practical benefit, is fundamentally a good thing. And I have to say that's one of the most useless ways to view justice that I can think of. Because if justice doesn't do anything to help people or better a situation, then what good is it? Which takes us to what I think justice should be. And in many ways, it's the exact opposite of what I've just described. Justice should be utilitarian or welfare maximizing, should be needs-based, and should focus on positive rights. Utilitarian or welfare maximizing meaning that if there is punishment, it needs to accomplish something, whether that deters crime, rehabilitates people, or restores that which was damaged. Needs-based, meaning everybody should have access to what they need in order to thrive. And positive rights, meaning that you're entitled to help getting something you need if you can't get it on your own. Basically, justice needs to accomplish something or it's not worth doing, and we have a moral responsibility to help and provide for those in need if they can't get things on their own. In this view of justice, we treat prisoners not simply as criminals to be punished, but as people, and give them opportunities in order to help them succeed. Basic needs are supplied by societal structures insofar as it's possible, and it's a lot less about how deserving someone happens to be, and a lot more about helping everybody, regardless of their merit. Why do I think this view of justice is better? Put simply, because as far as we can tell, it provides better outcomes for everyone involved. When courts show interest in defendants being successful during sentencing and allow relationships and trust to build between defendants and judges, defendants become much more engaged with the sentencing process and are less likely to become hopeless. Providing treatments to prisoners for substance abuse or deferring sentencing while they are in drug treatment reduces recidivism, and providing college education to prisoners significantly lowers recidivism rates and can actually end up saving the government money. Treating defendants and prisoners more like people who can use help and less like bad guys to be punished makes the public safer and reduces criminality. But of course, it does something else too. It treats defendants and prisoners better, which in and of itself is a good thing. It's understandably easy to just focus on those who are harmed by a crime or on society at large, but it's not as though criminals aren't people too. And policies that allow them to live better, more productive lives are also part of a system of justice that focuses on maximizing well-being. Plus, it's possible to simultaneously promote the well-being of victims and perpetrators at the same time. When restorative justice programs that aim to repair the damage that was done to victims, to recognize the impact that offenders had, and to reintegrate offenders into society were implemented, both offenders and victim satisfaction were higher compared to non-restorative justice approaches. And additionally, more offenders participated in and completed restitution to victims. And recidivism was lower. Beyond criminality and incarceration, prioritizing positive rights and putting systems in place to ensure them also leads to better outcomes. A good example of this is socialized universal healthcare, indicative of positive rights, versus a decentralized approach mostly based on employment, where what you get varies based on how good your job and coverage are, indicative of negative rights. The US, with a negative rights approach, has worse healthcare coverage, significantly higher costs, and worse health outcomes on a population level than basically all other rich nations who have socialized healthcare. More than that, governments focusing on providing rights like healthcare in developing nations can and do significantly improve the lives and life expectancies of their citizens. Welfare maximization, needs-based, positive rights. From prisoners and victims of crime to health coverage across countries to just how much money things cost, this view of justice leads to better outcomes. And just as importantly, you're much less likely to cause unnecessary harm and suffering. Because when the point of justice is to actually do something to help people, you're more likely to get good results and less likely to cause damage. And there's some indications that we are actually moving more towards this kind of justice in the United States. Support for the death penalty is only around 56%, down from approximately 78% in 1995, although Democrats and independents are driving this drop. And 61% of Americans agree the death penalty does not deter serious crime. In 2017, an ACLU survey found that a majority of people agreed with reforms that focused on healthcare, reducing prison populations, and not punishing, but rehabilitating. Many of those interviewed were conservative, and most were white. And a majority of Americans do say the federal government has a responsibility to make sure all Americans have healthcare coverage. Although again, this trend is primarily driven by Democrats and independents. There are some hopeful signs, but changing how we perceive justice will likely take continuous will, especially considering how retributive, merit-based, negative rights-focused justice is so tied in with many ideas about what it means to be America. So strongly consider what you think justice is and what you think justice should be. Ask yourself if it's more important that a bad person suffered, or if it's more important to treat people equitably and to focus on tangible outcomes. I would argue strongly for the second one, and think the evidence supports it as well. What should justice be? It should be something that actually promotes well-being and tries to help people as much as possible. Thanks for watching. How do you view justice, and how does this impact your views on other issues? Is punishment inherently good, and should we be focused more on tangible outcomes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next time.